I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Reimagining the Good Life, a podcast about challenging the assumptions about what makes life good, proclaiming the inherent belovedness of every human being, and envisioning a world of belonging where everyone matters. Today, you'll notice this is an extra episode for people who are subscribers because I wanted to address a really important recent topic that came up in the newsletter and many of you responded to. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Loftus, a family medicine physician who serves at a mission hospital in East Africa. We are talking specifically about the recent funding and personnel cuts to USAID. And we're going to talk about the reasons for those cuts, the repercussions of those cuts, and the ways in which our imaginations, whether that's a Christian imagination, a humanitarian imagination, or a political imagination, the ways those imaginations shape our beliefs about policy and aid and what should happen. We're also talking about how those of us who are concerned about those cuts can respond. Matthew Loftus lives with his family in East Africa, where he serves at a mission hospital. He's taught and practiced family medicine there since 2015. He also holds an MA in theology from St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute in Baltimore. He has written for Christianity Today, Mere Orthodoxy, First Things, and the New York Times. I actually reached out to Dr. Loftus, who has been a guest on this podcast before, after I read an essay that he and some colleagues wrote for the New York Times in January. There, they were asking for the Trump administration to maintain funding for PEPFAR. And to spell out that acronym, it's the United States' President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is a global initiative to fight the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So you will hear us talk about PEPFAR and how evangelical Christians played a major role in bringing PEPFAR into being. You'll also hear us talk about USAID, and that acronym stands for the United States Agency for International Development. All right, last thing I'll say before we get to this conversation. Dr. Loftus and I recorded this conversation on Wednesday, February 27th. And in the days since we recorded, I want to just read an update from an article in ProPublica, and we will link to this article in the show notes. So, quote, Secretary of State Marco Rubio completely ended nearly 10,000 aid programs in one fell swoop, including those that he had granted waivers just days earlier, saying the programs did not align with Trump's agenda. The move consigns untold numbers of the world's poorest children, refugees, and other vulnerable people to death, according to several senior federal officials. Local authorities have already begun estimating a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. It's grim news, but again, what we're talking about is not only the severity of the repercussions of these cuts, but also how we can imagine a good way forward and how we can all participate in that, even in our small ways. So here is my conversation with Dr. Matthew Loftus. Well, Dr. Matthew Loftus, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm honored to be here.
So a few weeks ago, you co-authored an opinion piece for the New York Times. I'm going to read the title here. The title was, As Fellow Pro-Lifers, We Are Begging Marco Rubio to Save Foreign Aid. So could you give a little bit of the backstory for people who don't know what might have prompted that piece in general, and then also what prompted you in particular to write it?
Yeah, thanks. So for decades now, USAID more generally, and PEPFAR more specifically on HIV and AIDS, has been using U.S. government money, taxpayer dollars, to fund a variety of development projects overseas. A lot of that is in health and education. For PEPFAR, it's very specifically zeroed in on HIV and AIDS prevention and treatment, especially providing antiretrovirals with a little bit of tuberculosis, since those two things tend to go together very closely, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I think one of the challenges here is that we talk about USAID and PEPFAR together, but they're two different programs. And I mean, even how PEPFAR came to be, like back in 2003, It was a George W. Bush initiative. There was a turf war, honestly,
Hmm.
between CDC and USAID, and it ultimately kind of got put in the State Department because the people who were doing it wanted to try to avoid some of the pitfalls associated with being USAID. So the op-ed was I think very specifically trying to focus on PEPFAR because it's a very special program. It's a very focused program. It I think is not vulnerable to some of the criticisms that I think USAID is vulnerable to.
Hmm.
And it's very, it's a very kind of open and shut. The design of the program is really focused around how do we treat HIV, prevent it from spreading, and help the people who have HIV live healthy lives. And so if it doesn't fall under that very kind of narrow rubric, it doesn't go in PEPFAR. And PEPFAR politically, it was really this merger of two worlds. You have Paul Farmer, hero of global public health,
Right.
but trained at Harvard, very left wing, and gay and lesbian activists of the 90s. So the sort of
Sure.
the original activists who had really pushed for greater research and development for HIV drugs in the first place. That activist movement moved very quickly from thinking about helping people with HIV in developed Western countries to helping people with HIV in non-Western, less developed countries. And it was that was one side, but on the other side you had conservative Christians. Like this was the era in which the summer mission trip was becoming more and more popular. There were more and more, I think, evangelical Christians who were getting to know more ministries over in Africa. Medical missionaries are watching the HIV pandemic just like slaughter people. And so you have these two worlds advocating together for more HIV treatment. So there's kind of two moments I feel like I sum it up in the history. One is this USAID administrator who is testifying before Congress and actually kind of in opposition to providing antiretroviral drugs to treat HIV in Africa. And he says, well, in Africa, people don't wear watches. There's not the same concept of time. So if you tell people you got to take a drug twice a day, they're not really going to understand that. And there was outrage. If it had happened in the age of social media, he would have been canceled. Right. I mean, people did attempt to cancel him. There was definitely some ire there. So that's one moment. He was the expert that had been summoned to Congress to talk about this. And then the other, I think, really powerful moment, I think, that sticks out in history is somehow there was this African HIV positive mother who brought her baby into Senator Jesse Helms' office. And Senator Jesse Helms, the crustiest of conservative Christians. And he holds this little tiny African baby in his arms, and he just kind of melts. And he writes this op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks later saying we should, as a nation, we should really tackle the problem of HIV in Africa, and we should be aggressive, and we should spend a lot of money on it. And, I'm not someone who likes to spend a lot of government money. It's not my thing. But I think that this is an important enough issue. Paul Farmer was also working a lot behind the scenes. Bono. That is a broader context of PEPFAR and how PEPFAR started. Yeah. And really, PEPFAR has remained very true to that mission of we're going to treat HIV. We're going to prevent the spread of HIV. HIV prevention, I think, have always been a little contested. And that was always a flashpoint. And I think it almost sunk the original issue because you had, I think, people on one side who were all about the safe sex and whatnot and condom distribution. And you had conservatives on the other side who were, basically like, well, can we just tell people to keep it in their pants? Right. And, they managed to find some compromises in terms of how the messaging was going to go out, right? Because you cannot just simply hand out medication, right? You have to build a whole infrastructure around delivering the medication. You have to have people who can counsel Receiving a diagnosis of HIV is, of course, one of the most devastating emotional moments in someone's entire
Mm-hmm.
life. So you need to have a whole trained cadre of people who are able to like get people in, get people started on their medications, talk to them about how to live with HIV, how to prevent it from spreading to anyone else, like how to deal with the community. Again, PEPFAR's mission is very much, is it about treating or preventing HIV? Then yes, they'll pay for it. But anything else, like, it does not fit.
In terms of the just understanding PEPFAR a little bit more,
Yeah.
you've given us a little bit of what was motivating people,
Mm-hmm.
but what was the argument as far as like why, whether it's a Christian argument or
Mm-hmm.
not, like
Yeah.
why American taxpayer dollars should fund HIV and AIDS, prevention or I don't know, in
Sure.
Africa? Like, why was that even something that we would argue was good to do?
Because it was possible. People are dying.
Yeah.
We have the drugs to prevent people from dying.
Yeah.
Another really powerful image was that Paul Farmer was walking around with like before and after pictures
Okay.
of people that he had treated in Haiti, because he had found some private and grant things to treat people in Haiti, and he had just had these before and after pictures of what they called the
Yeah.
Lazarus effect.
Yeah.
And so it really was just people are dying. This is an entirely preventable, treatable disease, and we can find the money for it. And so it really was just a very simple humanitarian. I mean, I think it was the same time as the Iraq War, and I think that there was
Hmm.
this very, now in retrospect, like, we should be suspicious of this, but this idea that like we could really transform the world for the better using American power. So PEPFAR is very narrow, focused, but it was also revolutionary
Yeah.
at the time. Whereas USAID has been around for a lot longer,
Right.
since the 60s. I think pre-Great Society, it was more with the John F. Kennedy anti-communism, the idea of like we have to engage the entire world,
Yep.
right? Like every other place in the world is going to be a battlefield between, Western freedom, capitalism versus, communism and all of that. So because of that, USAID has a much broader scope, and so it can be used for things that people find, um, outrageous. I think one of the things that people keep yelling at me about is some sort of transgender opera
Which I don't
performance.
think was really a thing. I think it was like, from what I read, that was
Yeah,
fact checked, and it was like, actually, no, that's not what it was.
it
Yeah.
is at the very least conceivable that someone
Right.
in a democratic administration might think that this was a good idea. And certainly, like USAID, I think is also, there is a lot more fraud, waste, and corruption in that system, because it is malleable. It's sort of like if the intelligence community is trying to do something in another country, they might use a USAID
Right.
project to do that.
Right.
Now, at the same time, like I know that there are um, American missionaries who have gotten into very close countries under the pretext of working for USAID.
Right.
And certainly a lot of missionaries have worked on USAID funded projects. So, like most of the mission hospitals that I know of in Kenya, for example,
Yeah.
had at least one building, that was built by USAID. And it might have been an eye clinic. You see the USAID logo on roads. They do feeding programs, they do education programs.
Right.
So they just have a much broader scope, much broader mandate, which I think opens them up to more political criticism. And I think also there's a lot more just shady stuff that happens in terms of, a USAID project when it gets implemented on the ground somewhere, it very well might, some of that money gets siphoned off to different places and things like that.
Okay, and we'll circle back to some of this, but again, just in terms of making sure I understand what's happened. A few weeks ago,
Yeah.
the Trump administration placed a freeze on USAID, which included PEPFAR. Can you explain, bring us into the current moment, more or
So the
less?
stop work order was for all foreign aid,
Okay.
anything and everything that could be considered, I guess, money going from the U.S. government to someplace other than America.
Okay.
I'm assuming that they excluded embassies from that,
Right.
because I mean you can't shut down embassies. I mean, well, I say you can't, and then there's all these terrible things that have happened the last couple of weeks that I did not think were really possible. Um, that stop work order was just sort of a blanket. If there's money going from the U.S. to somewhere else under any pretext of any aid anywhere, it stops. Um, and so that included USAID, and that included PEPFAR. Anything that counted as foreign aid got stopped.
Gotcha. And
Yeah.
my understanding is that the freeze was theoretically lifted when it comes to PEPFAR, but that has not necessarily played out on the ground. I've already mentioned this in my intro of you, but I'm just realizing that I should let you speak for just a minute about the work you do on the ground and why it is that we are talking about about
Sure.
this.
So I am a medical missionary. I work at a mission hospital in Kenya, near in the Central Highlands near Mount Kenya. I've been in East Africa since 2015, working at a couple different mission hospitals during that time. I see patients every day whose medications are paid for by PEPFAR. Really, the biggest thing that USAID does, or did, that it kind of interacts with my work, is they were funding a medication supply chain. They were funding this institution that was an initiative of the Christian Health Association of Kenya. It's called MEDS, Mission for Essential Drugs and Supplies.
Okay.
And basically, it was just logistics and infrastructure so that hospitals, so when when my hospital wants to order a great big truckload of IV solution, normal
Hmm.
saline that we use
Yeah.
every day in the hospital, right? That there is a warehouse somewhere that USAID helps to pay for that, helps to subsidize the cost of the medication, helps to pay the people, the bean counters who keep track of where the medicines are, how many we have,
Right.
how many we need to order, those kinds of things. To get that medicine to where we are. And then, like I said, there's a bunch of other USAID projects that do all kinds of different things, but that's kind of the one that comes to mind as sort of like my day-to-day work. So Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, put out a waiver within the week to say like, okay, so anything that's like life-saving, absolutely necessary kind of work, that's exempt from this
Okay.
foreign aid freeze. So in the first couple of days when the waiver came out, everyone was like, well, that applies to us, right? And then just kind of waiting for that confirmation. And then a couple of days later, there was more detailed confirmation that came out. The problem is, number one, you could say, okay, the medications, those are under the waiver. But like, is the bean counter in the
Right.
warehouse who's like responsible for making sure the medications get from point A to point B, is
Yes.
that person also counted?
Right.
And I think that there's been a lot of back and forth, and I think it was even more complicated by the fact that at the same time, the Doge, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, whatever, they were deliberately trying to destroy USAID as quickly as possible. And so anyone who might be like approving the payments, anyone who might be like coordinating the logistics, anybody who might be like answering the emails that say, hey, does this waiver apply to us or not? Like they were, trying to drive people out of their offices,
Right.
shut down the networks, right? Even, I have not seen any other reporting confirming this, but Washington Post put out something yesterday saying that like there was someone going around in the computer system, like manually trying to stop the
Payment.
life-saving, the payments that were approved under the waiver, like manually trying to prevent that money from flowing from, a U.S. government account to an account in Africa or whatever. Um,
And so, what are you hearing from the hospital where you work, where I know you aren't physically right at this moment, but like in terms of what this has meant for them on the ground? It's been about a month now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when the stop work order came, there was a whole lot of chaos and confusion. And then when the waiver came through, a lot of people said, great, we're going to keep moving with what we have. Now, depending on sort of how someone's money flowed, like, so one hospital in Eswatini was explaining, like, they work on like a they pay and then the U.S. government pays them back, and they were fronting the money for the next couple of months, but they don't have anything in their account right now. So they've had to kind of divert, shut down some of their like eye surgeries, for example, in order to try to use that money. They've had to send, a lot of hospitals sent some staff home, because basically they knew that the core thing was going to be getting the drugs to the people. Because once if someone is on HIV medication and they stop taking it, then that really puts them at high risk for developing a resistant strain of HIV, which is then much harder to treat.
Gotcha.
And so there was a very strong priority focused on, all right, so we know, like, we don't have the money. We're not getting the money right now. We don't know when we're going to get the money. So we're going to basically cut things down to a skeleton crew of staff. And most of the mission hospitals that I talked to, they basically said, okay, so we are used to these staff getting paid from the U.S. government. That money is not coming in through now, so we will sort of front the money now to keep people from, losing access to their HIV medications now. I think for some, especially for like pregnant women, they basically said, we don't know when we're going to get restocked with the medication, so why don't you just go ahead and take a 2-month supply? Yeah, so those are the kinds of things. That's basically what they did, is they sort of rearranged on the fly, but they sent a lot of staff home. Anyone who wasn't doing anything that besides handing out medication basically got sent home. Some clinics closed altogether. Certainly any clinic where there was like a little bit of PEPFAR and a lot of USAID, like, those places are shut down. Some of the warehouses are, locked, staff are furloughed, sent on administrative leave, like all kinds. And I think that one of the challenges is that, like, I reached out to one of the bigger institutions that has connections with a university in the U.S. It's kind of this big partnership. I think the U.S. university, probably just from the university alone, gives that hospital $1 million a year or more. And they also send people back and forth. They have a lot of research projects. I was trying to contact them, and they said basically they did not want anyone to talk to anyone in the media, say anything. And so I think a lot of people are really afraid to say what's happening, because they fear either that will kind of make them a target for retaliation. Yeah. Everybody kind of can see that, like, whatever happens, the overall pipeline of funding is going to get smaller. That's really inevitable. Even whatever turns back on is going to be less than before. Right. And so I think that there is a general sense of the people who keep their heads down the most are the ones who are most likely to get their funding restored. Whereas someone who sort of is known for speaking out about what's happening right now might be targeted to be excluded from that.
This is so helpful in terms of just getting a picture that is both, as you just gave us, like historic in scope, as well as pretty broad but specific about what's happening right now. So thank you for all of that. I wanted to also ask you about kind of the role of Christians within this turn of events in the past month, because I think one of the things that has felt confusing has been this sense of, okay, on the one side, you just told us the story, whether it's PEPFAR or USAID supporting just like mission hospitals, the sense of, my understanding is many, both the Catholic charities around the world, as well as many evangelical charities around the world, are getting a lot of funding from USAID. Like, there's a pretty strong Christian presence, as well as ongoing relationship of support, specific both to PEPFAR and USAID. And many Christians, whether that's you or me or, people writing for the New York Times, for other places, saying, we want to advocate for this type of humanitarian aid because of our understanding of the value of human life in this
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And yet there are other Christians who are really, I mean, we know that it was because essentially of white evangelical Christians that President Trump was elected, just kind of demographically. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of Christian support for him,
Mhm.
and even specifically for these types of actions. And so I'm just curious what you see or what you think about why there's this, because it's one thing to have political divides, right? It's another
Right.
thing
Right.
within a kind of worldview or ethos
Mhm.
of Christianity to be pretty polarizingly, I don't know if that's a word, but
Sure.
on very, very starkly opposite sides of this issue.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good question, and that is one of the things I'm trying to figure out for myself as
Yeah,
I'm
me too.
writing and thinking about like how what can I say that will help convince people of the value of this or that. So there's a couple different, I think, streams. One is whatever we're calling them these days, the shock jock Christians who I think are just really just negatively polarized against everything. I don't know. I mean, how they resolve the contradiction of feeling like Elon Musk is their guy.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, some of it just it seems like, at least based on what they say to me on social media, I think they kind of have this really evil thrill at the idea of dark-skinned people dying in another country because it makes liberals cry or something like that. And I really hope that that is a very, very, very small number of people, and that the vocal nature of their responses is disproportionate to their actual numbers.
Hmm.
But I think but that is certainly a vocal segment. Um, I think that there are a lot of people, who um, once they heard that there was a waiver, like in their minds, it was just like, okay, well,
We've solved the problem.
the problem has been solved.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We will only have the good things, and we will take away the bad things.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are concerned about how the government is spending its money.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a fair concern to have. I think that there is plenty in the world of foreign aid when it comes to waste, fraud, and corruption that could be combated. Um, but I think there's a difference between taking a tree to the sawmill and taking it to the wood chipper. And I think that, for them, I think it's related to the broader sense in which, the Republican Party and Donald Trump are sort of like somewhere between, God's chosen instrument of judgment and a necessary evil
Right.
to get anything done.
Yep.
Um, and so, I mean, it's hard to tell sometimes based on, because now people's news ecosystems are so vastly different from each other that there is someone for whom like a stop work order did not even connect to the idea that there would be like cessation of medications at mission hospitals, that those two things would like happen together. You know, polls often show that people believe that the U.S. government spends about 25% of its budget on
Right.
foreign aid. People think that it needs to come down to 10%, when in reality it's 1%, right? Like it's hard to tell how much of that simple like misapprehension
Yep.
um, is playing a role in this. And there's a lot of people I think who are, who if they know are either genuinely upset, but don't really have any place to change it since a lot of this is happening um, at the hands of unelected, unaccountable, deep state bureaucrats who they won't even say who it is sometimes.
Right.
Um, and so there's a certain amount of powerlessness of like, even if I called my congressman, like, could my congressman even do anything
Do
about this?
anything. Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so I think that there's different layers, and certainly, I mean, I think in general there's a sense in which, people felt like the previous presidential administration went too far in a lot of ways, and so kind of any way of reining that in is good for the
Hmm.
country, and that I think that's the most cogent argument that's being made to me is is, and the most sympathetically that I can kind of steel man that argument is,
Right.
like, yes, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but the bathwater is disgusting
Right. The bathwater is
and
so
filthy.
toxic.
It's
We
toxic
have
that
to. Yeah. Yeah.
it can't, baby can't be saved. So
Yeah. Right. 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 All right. Well, so let's just also make the case in an explicit terms for a Christian support of uh, PEPFAR and USAID, which is not to say Christian support of corruption and waste and graft and
sure.
all those things, but in terms of, yeah, can you just articulate the other side for a minute?
Yeah, I think that God has blessed America richly,
Hmm.
and that American power and American wealth are just simply unparalleled in the world
Hmm.
and in the history of the world. And there is still so much good that can be done. And I mean, I think it is still conceivable that just as we, cured polio and put a man on the moon, right? That we got rid of smallpox and we got rid of polio.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, almost got rid of polio. Like it's so
So
close.
close.
It's
I
so
know.
close. Right? That you can do the same thing for HIV, and there are now these long-acting ARV injectables, which is basically like it's. I mean, instead of like having to take a pill every day,
Hmm.
you get this injection, and it lasts for 6 months to a year.
I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is. It was going to be the next big thing. Um, I hope it is still the next big thing.
Wow.
I hope that 20 years, before I die, like
Yeah.
I mean, there will probably still be millions of people getting these injections, but like, we might be talking about HIV in the same way that we talk about polio
Yeah.
now. Well, there's a few cases happening somewhere out there, but
Right.
we pretty much have it locked down, and as long as we keep it locked down, we're going to be good.
Mm.
Um, and one of the things that got shut down were these trials that were, working on these medications, the long-acting medications, trials of vaccines for HIV and things like that. So, I think in just the sense of which in a global in a world in the world where we count on our stuff that makes our life comfortable coming from all over the world. Um,
Hmm.
and we count on our things being cheap because they are made by people all over the world. America has a certain duty to the
Yeah.
rest of the world to relieve suffering. I think from a Christian perspective, God is glorified when a young mother does not die of HIV and AIDS, but
Yeah.
lives and sees her children and her grandchildren graduate from high school. And so I think like it's great when Christians can do that through their private charity. And I think that's another dimension. Is I think a lot of Christians are like, well, yes, it's good to help people, but like that should be the church helping
Right.
people, and like the government helping. Like there's something suspicious about the government
Yeah.
helping
Yeah.
people, and I get that, and I like it annoys me to no end when I see like a politician who does not otherwise care about the Bible, like quoting from
Right.
Matthew 25, whatever you did to the least of these. I'm like, that I appreciate, your heart is in the right place. Your brain is missing in action. Right? Like we cannot map the Christian obligation to love onto like the political powers. But at the same time, like going back to Augustine, like love is still a organizing principle deep at the heart of Christian political theology.
Yeah.
Um, and for anyone who really wanted to nerd out about this, this is what I wrote my master's thesis about, which
Hmm.
you can find on my website.
Awesome.
Um, trying to spin out some of these things when it comes to healthcare. So yeah, so I think God is glorified when um, the kingdom of Satan as manifested, and the power of death is pushed back. I think it is an incredibly, from a more rational, like realpolitik kind of thing. I think that it is worth the U.S. government and the political power
Right.
to invest in the stability of
Hmm.
these countries. I think if you look demographically, like, even God forbid, even if we were to go back to 2000s, the 90s era deaths from HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, like sub-Saharan Africa is still going to be the most populous continent on the world in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And the demographics, like that's just sort of demographically how the world is going to look
Yep.
in the next few decades. And I think that, there's resources, natural resources that we want. This is now getting even more like cynical, right? But like your political interest in sub-Saharan Africa is still going to be very dependent on those countries being like stable and not constantly watching their youngest citizens just get wiped out by this entirely
Right.
preventable illness. And then I think from a public health perspective, viruses don't respect borders. The first cases of HIV in Western countries almost certainly came from Western travelers in in Africa who brought
Yeah.
them back to their families and other people in Western countries. And the way, like even if America pursues a very like zealous America first agenda, all it takes is like one super mutated HIV virus from someone in Africa who goes and works in another country, and then someone from the US goes and, there's virus spreads like that.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And so, like, if we don't want super resistant HIV showing up within our borders, like, we should be invested in not letting the disease run rampant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing you give both, I think, a kind of Christian argument as well as a national self-interest argument. I was thinking about that even when you were describing the, just driving around and seeing the literal signs that say USAID. I mean, it's like a PR campaign,
It is, yeah,
in addition to, and that again, in terms of how globally interconnected our world is, we could make again a Christian argument for caring for our neighbors, but
right,
we also could make just a political argument for why in an interconnected world we want people to actually say, oh, I'm grateful for the United States of America because and I
right,
want to
yeah,
stay on their
absolutely,
side. Like that,
yeah, yeah,
makes a lot of sense. And I think all of these things do kind of uh, speak to the ways in which the money and programs and people, the ways in which we utilize those in the world are shaping like a story and an imagination,
yeah,
not only about who America is, but also about who we are as humans, who we are as neighbors, as citizens. And right now, at least it seems to me like there, again, as you mentioned, maybe this is just a really loud voice on social media, but there's a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric
yeah, absolutely,
that is trying to put a certain type of American at the top of the human heap,
yep,
as a victor, and the rest are kind of weak and don't deserve attention. And then I think there's another strong, voice in America and around the world that says actually that's not what it means to be human. In fact, there is value to, I mean, I think about that story you told of Jesse Helms, right? Like
mm-hmm.
I see this little baby and I'm like, oh no, 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 if we can do something to value this life, we got to do it right now.
Yeah,
And I appreciate your voice speaking into exactly that place. As we come to a close, I do have one kind of final question, which is you may not have more of an answer for, but I wanted
mm-hmm.
to circle back to that question of,
Mm-hmm.
okay, if you are a concerned American who's listening to
Mm-hmm.
this podcast right now, is there anything to do? Is this just a wait and see? Is there any way to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the best way to respond is, so two things. I think one is that until the internecine squabbles within the highest echelons of power are worked out, right, that there are going to be mission hospitals and Christian organizations that are going to be working very hard to fill in the gap. And so I think the one organization that I always recommend people is the African Mission Healthcare
Mm.
Foundation, and they are just absolutely fantastic people. They support mission hospitals in a wide variety of settings, and they have not launched any kind of official thing, but they're sort of like my go-to recommendation for like how to support
Great.
um, Christian healthcare missionary work, because a lot of the hospitals they support are PEPFAR funded sites, and so they're going to be trying to help them fill in the gaps. Um, and then the other thing is that I think people should be contacting their representatives in Congress, because the fight to reauthorize PEPFAR is still going to happen in Congress. And once all this shakes out, like, at the Doge level or whatever, like, Congress will still be able to say, like, this is the amount of money that we're giving to PEPFAR this year. And one of the other things is that there has been concerns that PEPFAR funds might be used to promote abortion. There was an incident that happened where they realized that there were some providers in Mozambique that were paid by PEPFAR that had actually performed abortions. And there was a whole like accountability response to that I think just kind of demonstrates
Yeah.
the the rigor and the structure of the program. Our congressional representatives do need to hear, like, yes, please continue to protect PEPFAR.
Yep.
American Christians do care. We
Yeah.
want to see PEPFAR reauthorized. We want to see it fully funded. It is still a very small amount of the overall budget. Cutting PEPFAR does not plug the gap in, so is not going to fix the hole in Social Security or it's not going to balance the budget, right? It's still a relatively small amount of money every year. Like, in terms of number of lives saved for
Yeah.
dollars invested, is just one of the best bargains on the planet.
Hmm.
In a very like tightly run ship.
Hmm.
I think that those are kind of the two focuses. Is like, let's give sacrificially to
Yeah.
fill in the gap at the moment, with it, for the people who are really doing their absolute best to make bricks without straw at the moment. But also, like, looking ahead to the future, telling our representatives, hey, please, let's preserve PEPFAR.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for those very practical words, as well as for the bigger picture that you were able to invite us into historically and in the present moment. And thank you for the work that you do, and that I know you're returning to do. On behalf of some of the most vulnerable people in the world. We're really, really grateful.
Thank you for what you do, telling stories about
Hmm.
the things that people really need to hear about.
Hmm.